Well, the EU's top diplomat is warning Israel's offensive on Rafah will kill more civilians and that there are no safe zones left in Gaza. Joseph Borrell said the assault is being carried out despite explicit warnings against it from European Union member states and the United States. It comes after Hamas agreed to a ceasefire proposal offered by mediators. Israel said the terms did not meet its demands and pressed ahead with strikes on Rafah.
Offensive against Rafah has started again, in spite of all the requests of the international community, the US, the European Union member states, everybody asking Netanyahu not to attack Rafah. In spite of this warning and these requests, the attack started yesterday night. I am afraid that this is going to cause again a lot of casualties, civilian casualties. Whatever they say, there are 600,000 children in Gaza. They will be pushed to the so-called safe zones. There is no safe zones in Gaza. And the ministers will discuss about how to increase our support. But on the next Foreign Affairs Council, the political dimension of this crisis will be once again taken into consideration.
Joseph Borrell. Well, the parents of a young Israeli man held captive in Gaza for 7 months are demanding the government do more to bring him home. Omer Wenkat, who is 22, was taken on October the 7th. His parents want Benjamin Netanyahu to agree to a phased deal with Hamas that would see all captives returned to Israel in exchange for a humanitarian ceasefire. They say military action, particularly in the last 4 months, hasn't achieved anything.
We are still waiting for Omer. We are worried. We don't see anything that is happening. Not in the military act and not in the negotiation. They need to take act. All the leaders need to take act. They need to do more pressure on the other countries and more pressure on Egypt and Qatar and the US to build a satisfaction an agreement to take the old hostages out.
Omer is sick. I'm very worried about him, very worried about his medical condition. He's without his medicine, he's without this condition that without doctors that can see him. This is very worry situation for us, and we want the government to do everything they can to bring them back home now. We are talking now 7 months after the 7th of October. This is way too far, way too much, and all the hostages have to come back home.
For more on what's been going on around Gaza, I'm joined in the studio by Arise international correspondent Faith Orr. Good to see you, Faith. A ceasefire in Gaza seeming as elusive as ever. What's the latest?
We know that the Israeli negotiating team has now arrived in Cairo, but they have a message from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to stand firm on their conditions, which include, of course, the release of the remaining captives held in Gaza. We also have had an announcement from Hamas in the past few hours that one of those captives, a 70-year-old woman, has now died. She has died of injuries that she sustained a month ago in an Israeli airstrike. One other captive was badly wounded in that strike but is still alive. So while these talks are going on, people are continuing to die, but Benjamin Netanyahu does not appear to be backing down on this in the slightest. We have heard from some former Israeli officials today saying that if he was to make the concessions and agree to what Hamas has proposed, his government would simply collapse.
Meanwhile, of course, Israel carrying out its most intense bombardment of Rafah. We've seen footage of Israeli tanks rolling in. Tell us more about what's been going on there.
The tanks came in overnight under the cover of air attacks by Israeli fighter jets. They have seized control of the Rafah crossing. Now, the Rafah crossing was distinct in that it was the only land crossing not controlled by Israel. Egypt controls its side of it, but of course the aid entering does still have to be approved by Israel. The Erez crossing is still open, but it, before the war, was only used for people on foot and the Karam Abu Salem crossing is also closed following an attack there on Israeli soldiers by Hamas a few days ago. So the closure of this crossing is being described as a humanitarian catastrophe by the United Nations, because it stops all access for aid, and that's not just food, but that's also fuel. So there's going to be no water, for instance, because if you can't run a desalination plant, you can't supply water. There's going to be no trucks delivering the things that are already in the territory around Gaza, because there's going to be no fuel to keep the trucks rolling. So closing this crossing has huge impacts, not just immediately, of course, stopping people getting medical assistance, but in the long term. And that is a major concern there. And other than that, Rafah is under heavy bombardment, particularly in the east of the city. People are fleeing. I heard from a colleague who is actually in Deir al-Balah in central Gaza, and she was saying that people are fleeing from Rafah back up to central Gaza, up to Khan Yunis, Deir al-Balah, but it's so chaotic there, there's so many people there, that there isn't even anywhere to pitch a tent. She says people are pitching them on the beach pretty close to the waterline. I mean, that is how desperate the situation is getting as this offensive on Rafah sort of begins, and the worst of it is still to come.
And Israel saying it's killed 20 Hamas fighters, maybe that number's gone up now, in its operation in Rafah, and that it's found 3 tunnel shafts. The Palestinians saying many civilians have been killed. Is this the very precise and limited raid of Rafah that the Israeli military says it is?
I mean, they're bombing entire apartment blocks with families in them, children, women. So if they want to describe that as precise, I guess that's their definition. But there are entire residential blocks being reduced to rubble. So if they believe that that is Hamas infrastructure, but we are seeing the dead bodies being pulled out of there are women and children. So there is the debate there. There is Hamas in Rafah. I don't think anyone's arguing about that, but how they go about rooting them out is the problem. We've actually seen protests in Tel Aviv against this government action. They are angry that the captives are still being held 7 months into the war. They want their government to agree to a deal, and they say they need to stop the Rafah action because it's not going to achieve Israel's aims. It is only going to cause further bloodshed, and that's what we're hearing from the families who are protesting in Tel Aviv.
So basically it may not be a full-scale assault, but aid workers saying, as you mentioned earlier, that it's causing problems with little aid getting in at the moment. Meanwhile, as you also mentioned, and at the risk of making you repeat yourself, the diplomacy continues with the prospect of a truce hanging in the balance. How much in the dark are we with that after Hamas, as you said, accepted and Israel rejected that ceasefire agreement?
I mean, those talks continue. We will have to wait and see what happens. I think the key here with Rafah is if they launch the full-scale invasion, the talks are going to splinter and fall apart. And Israel doesn't seem to be suggesting that they're not actually going to. They're describing it as a limited operation, but the feeling amongst the army officials there, the feeling amongst the civilians in Rafah, is that they are terrified, is that they are waiting for the full-scale invasion, which they believe is coming. As I said, the UN is describing this as a catastrophe. The top diplomat of the EU, Josep Borrell, who we heard from earlier in the show, he says there will be so many civilian casualties, even in a limited operation. There is no way to avoid civilian casualties here.
In such a densely populated area.
Exactly. And let's not forget that forced displacement is a war crime under international law. I mean, that's not an opinion, that is a war crime. And by cutting off access to water, access to food, access to medicine, which is what's happening in Rafah, you are forcing people to displace, you're issuing these evacuation orders, and the United Nations is saying that, this needs to stop.
Faith, thank you very much indeed. Faith Orr is Arise international correspondent.